Okay, today's lesson is squares and square roots. Square root is right there. A square root of a number is a number that when multiplied by itself equals that given number. So if we use what's called a radical sign, which they talk about down here, but if I have the square root of 100, you're looking for n times n. Whatever number can be multiplied times itself to give you that number. So what number can be multiplied times itself to give us 100? Well, that's going to be 10 times 10. So you would say that the square root of 100 equals 10. Okay? So this number is your root. And that is going to be your answer to this square root. You have what's called there we go. You have what's called a perfect square. And when you have a perfect square, that means that it's the number with integers as its square root. So it's all positive and negative integers that are whole integers. So a negative 5 times a negative 5 would have the square root of 25. Could be negative, or it actually could be positive. There are both positive and negative square roots. So essentially what you're doing is you are doing what's called the inverse of squaring, okay? And I'll talk about that a little bit later, but there's quite a few vocabulary words here that are going to be new to you. Square root is that radical symbol, okay? Where you are finding the number when multiplied times itself is that number. The perfect square is the number that's multiplied together. So 3 times 3 equals 9. That's a perfect square, the answer, because it's one number times another number. 5 times 5 equals 25. That's a perfect square. 11.2 is not a perfect square because it doesn't have a number when multiplied times itself that will give you that number. Okay? Then you also have the radical sign, which is the symbol. It kind of looks like a division sign, but it has that little caret on the end. So that is called your radical symbol. And then you have your radicand, the number underneath that symbol. So if I have the square root of 144, this number is called your radicand. It's the number that you are doing the radical of. Okay? All right. So this is really not a difficult lesson. I love doing squares and square roots because it leads to something that I truly enjoy doing and teaching. But this really isn't too challenging. You are going to have to memorize those perfect squares because that's going to help you. So when I say memorize those perfect squares, that means that I am expecting you to know that 1 times 1 equals 1, and 2 times 2 equals 4, and 3 times 3 equals 9, and 4 times 4 equals 16, and 5 times 5 equals 25, and 6 times 6 equals 36, 7 times 7 equals 49, 8 times 8 equals 64, 9 times 9 equals 81, 10 times 10 equals 100. Oh yes, I expect you to go further. 11 times 11 equals 121. 12 times 12 equals 140. 12 times 12 equals 144. 13 times 13 equals 169. 14 times 14 equals 196. 15 times 15 equals 225. I expect you to have those memorized up through 15. Okay? That's going to help you immensely. All right, so that is my expectation. You will be having a quiz on those, so make sure that you have those copied down because you are going to have to know them. Those are called your perfect squares. So you are eventually going to be having a quiz on these, so make sure you have them and make sure you know them. Okay, so if you look here, there is the thing about perfect squares. There is 2 square roots of 49. So when I'm talking about, if I say the square root of 49, there are 2 answers to that because I could have 7 times 7 or I could have negative 7 times negative 7 because a negative times a negative is a positive. So truthfully, all square roots have 2 answers, except for one, and that is 0. 0 only has one square root, and that is 0, because 0 is neither positive nor negative. Now, if you look here, they also talk here about when they have a symbol that looks like that without just the square root symbol, the radical symbol. They're talking about a positive square root. They're looking for a positive square root. Here, they're looking for a negative square root when you have that negative symbol outside, and when you have that plus or minus in front, that means they're looking for both. Now, in 7th grade, if you would come across this on a standardized test, if they would ask you what is the square root of, it could be both, technically. So just so you are aware of that. The positive and negative, plus or minus, that really does come into high school algebra, 8th grade algebra. Okay, so you have to be able to find square roots. And again, like I said before, it's easier to find square roots as long as you have your facts memorized. That makes it a lot easier. So if they're asking you to find the square root of 25, you're going to write that the square root of 25 equals 5. Okay? If you have a problem like this, where you have the negative square root of 9 over 16, that really means that you're going to do, you separate that numerator from that denominator. And if it has that negative outside, they want the negative of it. So what I tend to like to do is I look at it as the square root of 9 over the square root of 16. The square root of 9 is 3. The square root of 16 is 4. And because there's that negative sign outside, it's negative. Okay, so if you look now, there are going to be times where you are going to actually have to solve problems that involve, or expressions that involve radicals. So if you look at this first example, example A here has 5 with a radical sign. It's a terrible radical sign. With 36 plus 7. What this means is when you have this 5 right up tight to that radical sign, that means multiply. You're going to multiply 5 times the radical, just like if it would be an x or a variable. So the first thing you have to do is evaluate or get rid of that square root. So you have 5 times, what is the square root of 36? It is 6 plus 7. And then you just follow your order of operations. 5 times 6 is 30, plus 7 is 37. Okay, that would be A. Now let's take a look at B. B has 1/4 plus the square root of 18 over 2. Now, this gets a little bit more challenging, because when you look at this right here, you're looking at that and you're saying, well, wait a minute. 18 isn't a perfect square, and 2 isn't a perfect square. So how do I solve that? Well, if you look at it, and you have to really start thinking mathematically if you want to be successful. So you have to look at this and say, well, I know that 18 isn't a perfect square, and I know that 2 isn't a perfect square, but I do know that if I take 18, and since that's a fraction bar, that also means divide, 18 divided by 2, you're going to end up with 1/4 plus the square root of 9, because 18 divided by 2 is 9. 9 is a perfect square. So that's 1/4 plus 3, because 3 times 3 is 9. Your answer then is 3 1/4. Okay, that is A and B. Let's take a look at C. So on C, what you're doing for C is you have the square root of 81, but that's in parentheses with a squared symbol outside of it, minus 5. So you still have to do this radical of 81, so that's 9 squared, right? Minus 5. Well, 9 squared is 81, minus 5 is 76. So you need to be prepared to solve expressions that involve square roots or radical symbols. There are also going to be times where you're going to have, and they like to do this a lot with area of a circle because it contains a square, you have to be prepared to be able to solve, and this is where the square root symbol really becomes helpful. If you look at this problem, they're talking about using that formula of area equals pi r squared. That's the formula for area of a circle. So you use that formula. You start by writing that down. Area equals pi r squared. We know it tells you that the area is 45,216 equals pi is 3.14, and we don't know our r squared. Okay? When you have this 3.14 right up by this r, even though it's squared, it still means multiply. So the inverse of multiplication is division. So you divide both sides by 3.14. And when you do that, you end up with an answer of 14,400 equals r squared. Well, like I told you before, this is the inverse that undoes the operation. So the inverse of r squared means you take the square root of r squared and the square root of 14,400. And you're then able to get rid of that squared symbol, and that becomes r, because r times r is r squared. So the square root of r squared is r. And that then equals whatever the square root of 14,400 is, which all of you should have memorized, right? That's 120. So your answer would be 120, and it would be feet. Not square feet, just feet. Okay? So that's kind of how you solve those types of problems. Oops. I want to clear this for a second here. So this is right up here what I was just talking about. This is really important. It's really important that you understand that when you square something, so if I have x squared, okay, that equals whatever, let's say that equals xy, that means that if I take the square root of x squared, you're going to get x. So, and then the square root of xy. So essentially what it's doing is it's the inverse. So the opposite of square rooting is squaring. So x squared, to get rid of that, you can take the square root of it. So it's like when we were doing multiplication, the inverse of multiplication is division. The inverse of division is multiplication. The inverse of addition is subtraction. The inverse of subtraction is addition. Well, now you have the inverse of squaring. You want to get rid of squaring, you can square root it to get rid of the squaring. So that's the opposite of it. Okay? So that's really what that means. Okay. Then I think I might be done. Let's just double check and I'll make sure. But I think, yes, I am. I think, I think what I'm going to have you do is I'm going to have you do this one right here. Pause your computer, do number 10, and then come back and we'll see if you did it right. Okay, for number 10, it says the area of a circle is 2,826 square feet. Write and solve an equation to find the radius of the circle. Use 3.14 for pi. Okay, so that means you need to start with your area equals pi r squared. We know that the area is 2826, so that goes under the A, equals, it tells you to use 3.14 for pi, so that goes under the pi symbol, times radius squared. So we need to get this r squared alone, so you divide both sides by 3.14. And 2,826 divided by 3.14 is 900. So 900 equals x squared. Now we have to get x alone. I don't want to know what x is. I want to know what x squared is. So you do the radical of x squared, and then you have to do the radical of 900, because whatever you do to one side, you got to do to the other. Well, the square root of x squared is x. And then the square root of 900 is 300. Okay? And then your label here is going to be feet. And you need to make sure that you label it. Okay? All right.